If someone accuses you of siding with corrupt American imperialist dogs and sympathizing with the evil supremacist cisgendered patriarchal founding fathers, give them the finger. An imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. Plutarch. As of 2015, the world's richest 1% own more than the other 99% put together, writes Kate Raworth in her book, Donut Economics. That stat was from 2015. It's become vastly more exaggerated since COVID, where small businesses have been crushed while the big corporations and the men running them have seen record expansions of their wealth. Year over year, while brick-and-mortar annual revenues were down 3%, online retailers like Amazon.com were up 27.6%, whereas 50% of the population saw a decline in their wages. 16% of the people saw their incomes expand. According to The Guardian, billionaires' wealth rises to $10.2 trillion amid COVID crisis. It adds, the super rich increase fortunes by more than a quarter during market turmoil. Why all this is important to understand is that Aristotle agreed with Plutarch when he declares that republics are fundamentally middle-class societies. Without a middle class, you can't have a republic. In politics, Aristotle says that you'll know you're in an oligarchy when income disparities become exaggerated. He then gets explicit, saying that in an oligarchy, virtue is no longer respected, only wealth, and that the government will stop talking about the people and instead will only start talking about trade and money-making. Have we noticed that? You have putative Republicans like Dan Crenshaw or Charlie Kirk from Turning Point USA saying that an American people don't exist at all, which would have come as some shock to Abraham Lincoln, who described America as a country of the people, by the people, and for the people. How can you defend the American people if you deny that they exist at all? This is the corporatist oligarchical view of America, not as a nation, but as an economic zone. They see the country as a Walmart whose citizens are interchangeable with any of the people from the third world. We're not citizens to them. We're human resources. The BBC had an article entitled, Study, U.S. and Oligarchy, Not a Democracy. In it we read, the U.S. is dominated by a rich and powerful elite. So concludes a recent study by Princeton University professor Martin Gillens and Northwestern University professor Benjamin I. Page. This is not news, you say. Perhaps. But the two professors have concluded exhaustive research to try to present data-driven support for this conclusion. Here's how they explain it. Multivariate analysis indicates that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. What we have to do in this appraisal of events is to trace the thread back, not just to the recent 2020 election where Time magazine admitted to corporate America and the Chamber of Commerce asserting manipulation over the election, but we have to go further back to 1933, when a financier named Bernard Baruch repurposed Mussolini's reforms in Italy and wanted to transplant them to the United States. He hired Gerard Swope to create a plan to take over America's economy. This plan would later be rebranded as the New Deal. At first it was called the Swope Plan. In short, it called for the creation of 75 new government bureaus to control 75 key sectors of the economy. When Baruch went to Herbert Hoover to pitch the scheme, Hoover looked it over and was mortified. He said the Constitution granted him no such power to control the economy. As the former president recorded in his diary, the origins of this scheme are worth repeating. These ideas were first suggested by Gerard Swope of the General Electric Company at a meeting of the electrical industry in the winter of 1932. Following this, they were adopted by the United States Chamber of Commerce. During the campaign of 1932, Henry I. Harriman, president of that body, urged that I agree to support these proposals, informing me that Mr. Roosevelt had agreed to do so. I tried to show him that this stuff was pure fascism, that it was merely a remaking of Mussolini's corporate state, and refused to agree to any of it. He informed me that in view of my attitude, the business world would support Roosevelt with money and influence. That, for the most part, proved true. Of course, as an aside, this group's plan to merge corporate and state power prevailed, with the government after the New Deal controlling business through the new practice of licensing. Before the New Deal, you didn't need a license to run a business, or diving, or scuba diving, or braiding hair in a salon. Afterward, you needed licenses for everything, even little kids running lemonade stands. By the way, Alvin Toffler mentions this in his book, The Third Wave, that the way societies are taken over in authoritarian coups is through licenses and credentialing. Baruch used exactly these methods to control the economy. After his New Deal was imposed, the government created agencies to regulate every sector of the economy, which is why we went from a slim skeletal republic to a bloated bureaucracy with a bunch of alphabet soup agencies. We acquired the Department of Agriculture, the FWA, the FTC, the FCC, NIST, the Department of this and the Department of that. 75 in total, all with regulatory powers over the respective area of the economy they oversaw. What's of interest here is the part about the control of society by way of licensing and credentialing. If a company stepped out of line, its business license could be taken away. If a person didn't have a college degree, like a guild card, he would be denied work. Chris Langan, the man with the highest estimated IQ in the world, recently tweeted out, "Academia is a monopoly designed to exclude non-paying non-members and their intellectual contributions. Think of this as a key ingredient of the academic business model. If anyone were able to participate in serious intellectual communication and commerce without academic credentials, this could severely diminish the value of those credentials, which have been inflated to the point of near worthlessness otherwise." Economist Adam Smith, writing from the year 1776, coincidentally the year America was founded, described how in the Middle Ages the guilds, or as they were then known, the corporations, artificially shrank the labor pool to keep wages high for their members. Just to give a little background, there were three main powers in the Middle Ages: the church, the king, and the guilds. The guilds wielded amazing power. They were almost socialist in bent. Instead of the free market determining prices, the guilds, like some medieval politburo, arbitrarily decided what prices should be. They also told you how much you could charge, or how much you could be paid. The guilds also forbade innovation. If you came up with a new way to make horseshoes, for instance, they'd come down hard on you, telling you that they had to be made just like your father made them or your grandfather. Because of the guilds, innovation was shut down, and Europe was stagnant for 1,000 years. It was essentially an early primitive version of socialism, or centralized control. The guilds would also do apprenticeship programs. Adam Smith complained that they would scam. A job that only required 6 months' worth of training, for instance, would entail a 7-year apprenticeship. This was a scammy way for master workmen to get free labor for 6.5 years from young apprentices. If kids didn't submit to this fleecing, though, the guild would deny them a guild card, thus forbidding them to work. Even if you had the skills as a carpenter, for instance, and people wanted to pay you for the work, the guilds would send the police in to arrest you. By this method, they kept the labor pool artificially small and kept wages high for their guild members. They did not want competition, free markets, or what we would call capitalism. Adam Smith, of course, was a champion of getting rid of the guilds, of having open competition so that the labor pool would increase and prices would fall for the consumer. By this means, productivity would rise and everyone would be better off. Well, everybody, except for the guilds. Smith said that the guilds had power with the legislators, so they could enact policies that benefited them, but at the cost of creating mass unemployment among the people. Society dealt with this by having the church take on charity to help the people shunted out of the labor pool by these policies. They would give the people forbidden to work housing and enough food to scrape by. Smith comments that this was the evil of the corporations, as he called the guilds. Smith said that labor is the wealth of the poor. It's the only thing that a poor person can trade to make a living. The rich, by contrast, have other assets which generate wealth: land, capital, stocks, bonds, and so forth. A poor man has only his labor. By forbidding him to work, you're robbing him of his wealth. You're also doing something else. You're creating mass unemployment, which society now has to deal with. At first, the churches took care of these displaced people. Then Henry VIII kicked the Catholic Church out of England, and for the first time, the government had to pick up the slack. They enacted what came to be known as the Poor Laws. In this way, England became the first welfare state, and it was driven by the corporations who created bottlenecks that inhibited people from working because they didn't have a guild card. We're like that today, as I alluded to before regarding our new penchant for licensing and credentialing. By this method, the oligarchs can choke off the labor pool and keep wages for their guild members artificially high. Think of New York City, where the big corporations lobbied to have a taxi license instituted to drive out the independents. The new license cost $1 million. If you were a guy with one cab making $45,000 a year, you couldn't afford the license, so you were driven out of the sector. Once all the independents were driven out, the large cab companies hiked their fares. It stunk for the consumers who now had to pay higher prices. It stunk for the independents. But hey, who cares? The large corporations won. Walmart is doing this now to crush mom and pops by pushing a $15 an hour minimum wage. They know they can pay it, but they also know that it will kill their competition, after which they can jack up their prices. Look at how a college diploma is used to keep people out of jobs that they could easily do without one. America's most famous newspaperman, H.L. Mencken, never went to college. In 2021, he'd be denied a position on any newspaper, despite towering in talent above anyone writing today. Do we really need licenses to braid hair, or to do beautician work, or for a child to run a lemonade stand? No. What's happening today is just like in the Middle Ages, a tiny powerful class is throwing up barriers to entry in the workforce, and the result is just like what we saw in the Dark Ages. mass unemployment, and a new welfare apparatus to deal with the people forbidden to work by a corrupt system. People often ask, if socialism is bad, why do all the corporations seem to want it now? Why is Silicon Valley calling for universal basic income? Why are all the same people from the Chamber of Commerce backing reparations and funding Antifa and Black Lives Matter? The reality is, the welfare state is caused by the corporations, who create barriers to entry in the workforce and/or pipeline in foreign workers to displace Americans. Due to the economic carnage that ensues, society now requires an apparatus to take care of the superfluous people. When it can't, you have things like what Ann Case is setting up an outcry about, America's rising suicide rate. In an article by the American Psychological Association, we read, Princeton University economists Ann Case, Ph.D., and Angus Deaton, Ph.D., have shown that deaths from suicide, drugs, and alcohol have risen steeply among white middle-aged Americans since 2000. They argue these deaths of despair are linked to a deterioration of economic and social well-being among the white working class. This is what happens when an oligarchical class rigs the economic system so that Americans can't even get jobs in their own country, as big business pipelines and foreigners and H-1B visa holders to take all the employment slots, which is why the Center for Immigration Studies has a report stating that all employment growth since the year 2000 went to immigrants. Even hardcore neoliberal economists are now admitting that globalization has been disastrous for the middle class, such as the Foreign Affairs article Economists on the Run, which said Paul Krugman and other mainstream trade experts are now admitting that they were wrong about globalization. It hurt American workers far more than they thought it would. People often wonder how capitalism decays into socialism. The answer is, of course, found in how the guild system degraded into the technological and economic stagnation of the Middle Ages. You have a top-down oligarchical structure, bars to entry in the workforce, mass unemployment, and suddenly you need vast new bureaucracies to take care of the poor that the system created. Adam Smith turned out to be right. Get rid of the licensing and credentialing. Get rid of the bars to entry to working, and the economy would boom. In the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries, the average American worker made 2 to 3 times what his European counterparts made. 18th century economist Thomas Malthus talks about this, as did Henry George in the 1880s, as well as South Korean economist Ha-Joon Chang in the modern era. We were the richest nation with the largest middle class in human history. Our wealth generation was unprecedented. We could go back to that, or we could do what we're currently doing and stay on course to repeat the Dark Ages. A reminder, though, our republic was not a product of the Dark Ages, but of the Age of Enlightenment, not of medieval serfdom, but of freedom. And if we want to keep that republic, we're going to have to think of ways to keep our middle class. Just to repeat in closing, an imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. People fear any political leader who has his finger on the red button. What political leaders fear is people having their finger on the red button, the subscribe button. Push it and see their narratives explode. Also consider donating to help keep these videos coming. And don't forget our website and newsletter, thenewamerican.com.